Thanks everyone. Long time no see, everybody. It's good to be back in Madison. Feels like I haven't left. This is more interesting than my usual evening plans, which usually involve unpacking boxes and other various kind of boring tasks related to moving. So a little bit more exciting than what I'd probably be doing if I was sitting in my apartment in Chicago. So as I kind of reflected on this topic a little bit, there is a few things about Revelation and about our theological agreement about it that are ultimately a little bit unsatisfying. So I have to kind of warn about that at the start, that there's no definitive list that orders all the teachings of the church in order of their importance, and there's no line underneath one part of that list that says below, these are the things you don't have to believe. You know, these are things you can kind of just ignore, or whatever. So in that sense, it's a little more open-ended, and because it's more open-ended and less definitive, it's the kind of talk that you can actually give to a little bit more theologically educated audience, like a mustard seed audience. You wouldn't like necessarily give a talk that's like really open-ended in like RCIA or something like that, because it's just not catechetically pastorally appropriate. So in any sense. In any sense, I just wanted to say that kind of at the outset. There's a sort of relatively lengthy discursus that I wanted to begin my talk with that I think will probably not, it will not seem like it will not seem like it has anything to do with the stated topic of tonight's talk, which is on Revelation and on theology. But it didn't really fit anywhere else in the talk, so I wanted to put it at the beginning. Has anyone ever heard of Albert Schweitzer? Okay, there's one. All right, I get like maybe one or so. But Albert Schweitzer he was kind of a Renaissance man. He lived in the early 20th century, so relatively modern figure. He had 2 PhDs. He won a Nobel Prize for some of his humanitarian work. He had a very diverse set of contributions to a number of different scholarly fields. He was a musician. He made lasting contributions to medicine. One of his PhDs was in theology, and for his dissertation he wrote a study of all of the people who had ever studied the historical Jesus. Okay, so just to explain kind of what that is. So you could take a historical figure, right? You could take the documents that we have on any given historical figure, and you could segregate them into what you thought was the most reliable types of evidence about that figure, and things that you thought maybe weren't true for whatever reason. And you could do this in practice, this scholarly exercise for pretty much anybody. And so Jesus is a very interesting figure historically, and so a lot of people have done this over the ages. So for example, Thomas Jefferson somewhat famously put together a version of the New Testament that had no miracles in it, because he didn't think that he didn't believe that it was possible, that those were fancy. And so you can use kind of various criteria to apply this to Jesus. And so for example, the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper seems like it's incredibly likely to be historical. Almost no one would dispute that, no matter what their theological background, because there's evidence of it in Paul's letters, which predate probably the writing of the Gospels. There's evidence in both the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and Mark, and John. So there's a lot of independent attestation to it. So that seems relatively plausible. But at any rate, all these different figures, Schweitzer sort of argued in his book that tried to come up with a historical picture of who they thought was the sort of authentic Jesus, trying to go beyond the text, so to speak. Whether it was Jesus was this pacifist kind of hippie-ish kind of figure would be like one way to think that was really who he was as a historical figure. Or maybe he was this kind of militant, kind of revolutionary type figure. That was maybe another answer. But that every single person who had undertaken this study and supposedly kind of objective scholarly approach to studying Scripture had basically come up with a portrait of Jesus that was essentially a theological reflection of all their own beliefs. And they basically use this process, this scholarly exercise, and basically created a Jesus going beyond, beyond what's present in Scripture, to sort of just basically do away with the things they didn't want and just to keep the things that they did. And so I'd say this this story because I think it's an interesting empirical example of the fact that God, revelation is God's self-disclosure to humanity. I think in many ways naturally presupposes an authoritative magisterium, which is also divinely inspired, an authoritative teaching body. Because without it, the pursuit of truth and the interpretation of revelation is subject to our own human whims and essentially becomes a mirror image of whatever we want to believe. And I think we can see that, and probably we all struggle with it to some extent if we were raised with certain dispositions or not. There's always things that are going to be harder to believe and things that are going to be easier to believe. And so I think that struggle, the tension between the idea that revelation really requires a magisterium, it requires this humility and assent to truth, is kind of at the core of what the problem, the biggest problem is with revelation in the context of our broader society. Is anyone reasonably confident they could give a definition of the magisterium? In front of a lot of peers, probably not, maybe less confident. So, I mean, it really just means the authoritative, the fact that the church teaches with authority, right? Okay, so not really complicated. I did want to make sure that I said that before I got too far, because probably not everybody knows. So I did want to talk a little bit about, because in my own conversion to Catholicism and my own spiritual growth, the idea of authority became very important to me because I was in college, and this was probably 40 years ago, and I really felt like Christianity was right, that the values that it embodied, were the right ones. But I was there's 5,000 different denominations, and I was so, a lot of my beliefs were changing. I didn't know who was right about certain things, and I was like, I could never figure out which of those ones is right. And so the idea that there was this sort of traceable authority to Jesus was really important to me. It was kind of one of those kind of initial things that was really helpful. So immediately in the Gospels, one of the things that has always stood out to me is one of the things that attracted people to Jesus' teaching is that it says he taught with authority. That was one thing that distinguished him from a lot of the other, kind of itinerant preachers that were present in his day. And that was something that, one of the main things that attracted people to him, that distinguished his teaching from others. And in the Gospel according to Matthew, we read in chapters 15 and 17, where he gives, says, "You're Peter, on this rock I will build this church," right? And he says, "And I give you the authority to bind and loose," and he later gives that same authority to the other apostles. And then Catholics believe the doctrine of apostolic succession is that authority is passed on through bishops, right? And so, for example, Paul in his letters, he says that he's an apostle at the beginning of his letters, and that's kind of to establish his authority, I would say. And because he's writing to tell them to do certain things. And so, and certainly the early church believed that the bishops exercised a certain special kind of authority. So the doctrine of apostolic succession. When Jesus said that he gives you the authority to bind and loose, what that meant, it meant two things in the context of the Jewish culture. It meant, one, the ability to interpret teaching, right? So one of the things we believe the magisterium has the authority to do, and also the ability to sort of determine the bounds of what was the bounds of what was acceptable. So who was kind of within the bounds of proper teaching or not. And so those are two really constituent parts of the authority that we believe bishops exercise. So there's this kind of historical debate because we don't have a ton of documents from early Christianity, and it's it's dispersed throughout the world, right? So even if it's the historical project of figuring out what everybody thought in the early church is complicated. Nevertheless, we can draw some conclusions. So St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was martyred probably somewhere between the year 90 and 100, so actually predating some documents in the New Testament. He wrote a series of letters on the way to his martyrdom, and he had a very clear threefold distinction between authoritative distinction between deacons, priests, and bishops. And actually, this letter was so because Protestant scholars had always kind of assumed that this sort of popery stuff kind of came around in like the year 1100, 1200. That was kind of this later development. That they actually thought that they were, a lot of Protestant scholars actually thought that these were forgeries when these documents first came out, because it was it so clearly established this very distinct hierarchy in the early church. Another thing that is important that I'll touch on a little bit later, but I do want to talk about now, is one of the last things that was hardest for me when I became Catholic was the concept of infallibility. And so that was kind of one of the things where I would say was in a state of suspended judgment on at the end. And so I was, at the time I entered the church, I was like not really sure it was something I could go along with or what I believed about it. And so I was reading at the summer after I converted and became Catholic, I read this. If you ever want to read a history of what different Christians have thought, read Yaroslav Pelikan's 5-volume series on the history of Christian doctrine. It's very good. It's excellent. And that was what I did the summer after I converted. So, but really good. And he's also, interestingly, he was a Lutheran and actually later converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, interestingly enough. But at the time, and he wrote in one of the earlier volumes, he talked about how it became kind of unquestioned. That Rome was always sort of viewed as the first kind of authority in the early church, and after a while, it became it became somewhat unquestioned whether Rome had ever erred, and this question started to emerge whether Rome could ever err. Interestingly, and I thought, well, if a Lutheran is writing this, there must be something to that, and there must be some degree of plausibility to the idea that something could be infallible, and that the Pope could be the source of that. And then later, it really wasn't. So it really wasn't formally the doctrine of papal infallibility wasn't really formally spelled out until the First Vatican Council, which was in the 1850s, essentially. So it was later. It took a long time for the years to kind of get going, but once they did, and it was a very gradual and continuous development, and it wasn't just this thing that someone came up with in 1800, like, hey, maybe we should just give more power to the Pope. It didn't really happen like that. And so the concept of papal infallibility. Another issue that I wanted to touch on was one that comes up for Catholics, which is the idea that has the church ever changed an authoritative or a meaningful teaching that just wasn't just kind of like some kind of one-off bishop going on and saying something. And so the church, one of these debates that's being in finance that was kind of near to me was the one on usury, or the one whether or not the charging of interest was immoral. And I just thought this was interesting, kind of having both a background in kind of history of economics and monetary things, and also in church teaching. And so it's very clear that the church condemned a lot of the practices in the ancient world, of lending. And this is sort of problematic because a lot of people can't imagine our society without debt today. And I think it probably could exist without debt, but it seems like it's often put forward as a candidate for maybe the church was wrong here, and maybe the church teaching changed. Well, the institutions that existed in the ancient world were very different than we find here today with our world of like subsidized government loans and so forth. The first people who lent money were basically loan sharks, and they charged 25% interest per week, which compounds to over 11 million% per year. And the so if you have student loans, like try paying off like a student loan from that guy, right? I mean, that would be like, oh, I owe I borrowed $1, and now I owe like over $100,000 in a year. So, I mean, essentially, those institutions, before the advent of judicial systems where you could actually enforce repayment rules and things like that, interest had a very different meaning because it was a punitive tool, and it had to be extremely high because you had to have the person pay back next week, or they were going to fear they were not going to be able to pay back at all. So it was almost you had to charge a high interest rate in order to incentivize paying you back, which is almost kind of counterintuitive. And they had to be enforced essentially with violence. You couldn't give someone a loan unless you could violently maim them or worse. And so the type of institution that existed was very different than what exists in the modern world. And at least my read on it is that perhaps what the church was condemning was not something that is at all like what exists today. Furthermore, for example, Thompson Aquinas says that it seems reasonable if you're renting an apartment, for example, you're borrowing someone's physical capital and you're paying them to borrow it. And if that's okay, and if it's reasonable, and it's not, we're not in a society where they would have to like physically harm you to get you to pay your rent. That's not the only option. If it's not this institution that's basically predatory, then that seems reasonable. And so it does seem like it's consistent with Catholic teaching. The institutions, at least on one reading, the levels of in society are consistent with Catholic teaching. So, but again, very complex debate. I think I wanted to go through kind of one specific case of that because I think it kind of comes up a lot. And the reality is that all these debates are enormously multifaceted and incredibly challenging, really. And so, so if you're sort of confronted with a situation like this, it's important to kind of get to the bottom. Well, what documents were they? Was it actually like, was it just some priest saying that, or was it actually like an authoritative type of document, which we will get into in a little bit. So the Second Vatican Council used the phrase hierarchy of truths to describe the fact that some teachings are more important or more central to Catholicism than others. And for example, when we say the Creed at Mass on Sundays, and those are very pivotal, foundational beliefs of our church, and so those would clearly be higher than maybe something that was in kind of a lesser document. And so what the Catechism does identify one teaching as on the top of the hierarchy of truths, although after that it gets a little bit muckier. And I was wondering if anyone could guess, what does the Catechism say is on the top of the hierarchy of truths?
The single. What do you mean?
What what doctrine, faith, or what church teaching is the highest?
First commandment.
The Immaculate Conception.
God exists.
Trinity?
Incarnation.
No, it's the Trinity, actually. Interesting. Which makes sense. And the idea that the idea that because all and the church says, and the Catechism says that all of the other mysteries of the faith really flow from the Trinity. You think about it, it's true, because all of the sort of created things would depend on their existence on the Trinity, and God's self-revelation as a Trinity it's the essence of what God is. And so God's sort of communal three persons in one, three persons in one essence is the foundational truth, so to speak, Christianity. So anyway, the Trinity is on top. It becomes a little more complicated after that, and anyway, so we're gonna finally get to eventually get to the what do I actually have to believe stuff. But this is so I just wrote because I didn't want to write it while I was talking. So at the top there's dogma, and then there's doctrine, and then there's discipline and prudential judgments. Okay, so these are three sort of broad categories, and there's like we mentioned, within these categories there's even kind of some that are more important than others. So what makes something a dogma? Well, there are two things, and again, there's no official list of what's a dogma and what's not. So there are two things, and so basically something is divinely revealed and taught to be divinely revealed. Now that sounds kind of well, isn't that like everything? So I think that the easiest way to kind of help you understand what these categories are is to just sort of to give examples of them. And so dogmas, so like I mentioned, the Articles of the Creed are dogmas. And if you're reading documents reading official documents or encyclicals or whatever, usually a dogma kind of stands out because when you read it, it says that usually there's a definition in front of it. So I brought an example of a dogma that I'm going to read. This is sort of more recent. So in one of John Paul II's encyclicals, Evangelium Vitae, he discusses euthanasia among other things, and kind of the structure of it is helpful. So he says, taking into account these distinctions, and he says, in harmony with the magisterium of my predecessors. So he's explicitly taking into account the fact this is something that has been taught for a long time. He's starting to kind of evoke this authority. In harmony with the magisterium of my predecessors, and in communion with the bishops of the church. Okay, so the Pope is infallible when he speaks as basically the head of the bishops of the church. If he's speaking of his own faculties, he doesn't exercise the character of infallibility. I confirm that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law, since this is deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person. This doctrine is based upon the natural law, so that's important. So because it's based on the natural law, it's something that can be known with reason, and something that we can legislate about in political context. It's not something that just Catholics would know. And written upon the Word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition, and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. So basically, in mentioning, and particularly the universal magisterium, this is something that he's saying this is something that we've always taught as a church. We haven't maybe explicitly defined, or we haven't necessarily explicitly defined it as a dogma, but I'm doing that here, basically. So, dogmas kind of stand out. If you read, has anyone ever read any councils that weren't to the Second Vatican? Yeah, right. There's like one other church nerd person here. They're really, especially like Trent, which was kind of in contrast to the Protestant Reformation. They're like really defining these things, and they're like, they're being like really, there's like a sequence of, like this is heresy, and it's like pretty intense. And they were also a little less tactful back then. So it takes a certain type of person to enjoy reading church history. I happen to be that type of person. So they stand out. I would say that most of the time, and there's interestingly, the Second Vatican Council is the only council that never explicitly defines anything as a dogma, which is kind of different. And so maybe they were trying to make a point like, I don't know, there's all kinds of takes on the Second Vatican Council, but that might have just been that they were trying to be more sort of pastoral in nature, and they were trying to kind of intelligently communicate with the modern world. I brought my copy of the Decrees of the Ecumenical Councils. So there's been, just for kind of illustrative purposes, so there's been 21 ecumenical councils. This is the first 18 in Volume 1, and the last 3. So the last 3, Trent, and then the First and Second Vatican Council. And it kind of gives you a sense of how recent a lot of, since the printing press and since modern communication, there's been so much more church teaching, and it's so much more frequent, and it's so much more nuanced. And some of it's less authoritative because it's newer, frankly. So anyway, so those are dogmas. Most of what we think of when we think of church teaching is probably doctrine. I would say if you were to read through the catechism or something like that, now the catechism doesn't have, it's not in itself an authoritative document. It cites a lot of authoritative documents, and it's very important, but most of the time you're just kind of reading theology, something that sounds kind of theological, kind of church teaching-y. Most of the time it's doctrine. The church's moral teaching would fall into this category. And so most of the things that are doctrine. And so as we kind of get down the scale, we get down to things that are, less authoritative, and that if disagreeing with the church up here is very, very serious, and it's possible down here to stay in communion with the church. And so as we kind of move down, it gets a little bit less authoritative, essentially, is the idea. So doctrine. Now, then there's church discipline. So I also brought my code of canon law, which is, this is Latin and English, so exciting. This is great bedtime reading. And I probably have read before, probably not very frequently. Even I'm not that big of a nerd, but so canon law is basically rules. It's one example of church discipline. It's basically rules that govern the church. It's deals with all kinds of annulments and procedural things, and what orders can do. Other examples of church discipline are a lot of liturgical rubrics. We have how we celebrate the Mass is church discipline, and even one example that's kind of well known is the fact that we only ordain celibate priests. That's a church discipline. We have the option of ordaining priests that are not, that are married. We have that theological option. The church chooses not to. That's its discipline. So that's something that potentially one could disagree with, because it's in that lowest category. Also importantly, there's not universal agreement about what necessarily where the boundaries are of these categories. Kind of troubling. It kind of it's one of these things where there's not always a definitive answer, and you have to go and take a look at an issue. If there are questions at the end, I'm sort of hoping there won't be like 8 million questions on specific teachings about where they are, and I have to like trace through like all the documents that they're taught about. But if there are questions, I'm happy to kind of try to help put them towards the right category. Interestingly enough, and kind of affirming the fact that these disciplines can change is the last code of canon law, which is 1751, which says that the supreme law is the salvation of souls, and it's sort of implicitly putting at the end is interesting and meaningful, but it also kind of implicitly affirms that in many contexts that the laws of the church, in some contexts, there is room for how they are applied. And I don't really want to get into, I'm trying hard to stay away from getting sidetracked in really controversial stuff. But, so in any way, sometimes canon law for pastoral reasons can be sort of enforced or not enforced. There's some flexibility that bishops have that they enjoy. So I talked a little bit, another kind of distinction, if you're a Catholic, there's like all these like documents that come out, right? Like the bishops release a document, the Pope does this, there's like these council documents, there's like Code of Canon Law. So the councils are definitely going to be very high. Anything that's a result of an ecumenical council, things that are in church discipline, kind of lower. And within the Pope's writings, the Pope has encyclicals, right? The Pope has a lot of different things. So in order of importance are encyclicals, apostolic letters, apostolic exhortations, and then other audience the popes give. So actually, if you go to Wednesday audience, that's actually an exercise of the Magisterium. It's very low on the sort of ranking of what's important, but it's actually an exercise of the Magisterium. I missed a little bit prudential judgments. So prudential judgments are probably one of the categories of teaching that's it's one of the things where people can conscientiously dissent, provided that they're having kind of an authentic discernment process. They're trying to figure out what the gospel really compels us to do. They're researching exactly what's going on. Prudential judgments tend to be application of broader teaching to really specific cases. So, for example, the U.S. bishops condemned the use of nuclear weapons. And so it's this kind of specific technology, right? It's a pretty unique type of application of a broader teaching that's informed by a number of things. But that would be one example of a case where you're applying something broader to something more narrow. So generally, prudential judgments they have a very narrow sort of scope. I wanted to close with just kind of a short reflection on how controversial documents and teachings play a role in the pragmatic and pastoral function of the church. And I think that especially among people that are younger and tend to come from, mustard seed is a little more theologically conservative, I would say, that the temptation is to kind of be like, everybody needs to agree with me like right now, and like if there's like if someone if someone has a different type of opinion, then that's really bad, and like it's everything's got to be fixed now. And things take quite a bit of time in the church. People generally convert because they're first attracted by something about the church, and then they go through some kind of process of discernment, and it's very slow and it takes time. And God's patience, thankfully, is much greater than ours. And so, and there's this phrase in Catholicism called the law of gradualness, which is essentially the idea that people must be exposed to the truth gradually in the process of conversion. And as a little bit of a counterpoint to that, John Paul II has this great quotation, which I like a lot, which kind of underscores how difficult it is to, generally in practice, to deal with, to balance kind of this sort of slowly kind of introduce the truth with the reality and the fact that people have a right to the truth also. And he says the law of gradualness should never be confused with the gradualness of the law, which essentially means the gradualness of law, meaning that, okay, the laws don't really actually apply to you, we're going to sort of fudge them, or not make you, or that they don't actually matter for you. And the truth always binds all people, and the process of conversion and pastoral engagement is complex and multifaceted. So at any rate, I wanted to end on that. And I don't know if we have any time. I don't know. Happy to take questions if there's time. Yeah.
So we've been talking a lot about dogma and doctrine and the Magisterium. But obviously God reveals himself before, the Magisterium, before the church was founded in the Old Testament. So we have things like, the Ten Commandments, which are, divinely revealed, maybe dogmatic, you might say. But then you also have things where we see Christ, there's the law that the Hebrews had, and we see Christ at times very much say, no, that's wrong. Like, your interpretation of the law here is wrong. So would you draw a correlation between kind of these dogmatic doctrine and discipline in the New Testament, I guess, and what the Hebrews had in their law and their divinely revealed kind of hierarchy?
That's a good question. I think I would say certainly that it's hard to speak of specific scripture passages as dogma, because the church almost never comes out and says, like, this is what this passage means, and like this is like the interpretation of this passage. So it's tough to say that that something that's in Scripture can be subject to a lot of different interpretations, and so it's hard for me to even think of an example of like a dogma where like the literal words of it actually come from Scripture. So I would say so the relationship between, and so to kind of get a little more directly to your question, so it's kind of about, if I'm understanding it correctly, the relationship between Jesus is more sort of definitive. Is that fair, or were you definitive than the Old Testament, or how does he develop the law?
When we go through the laws and rules of the Hebrews, would you say there's also this hierarchy? Like there's these rules that God revealed in the Old Testament, which are very like higher dogmatic revealing. So I would say Ten Commandments.
Okay, sure.
There's no way you can be like, well, that's just a discipline. It's like that's dogmatic.
Yeah.
But then there's other things that we see that it's like more like the disciplines the Hebrews had in the law.
Yeah.
Would you draw that correlation to, I guess, the Jewish hierarchy and the Magisterium?
Sure. I mean, I think I would. I think you're right on there, and I think. My answer to the question is to basically repeat back to you most of what you said, which is not that great, but hey. The Old Testament needs to be always interpreted in light of the New Testament. And so one consequence of that is that certain things have very different implications. Some of them, for example, the disciplines in the Old Testament. I wouldn't really necessarily say they're disciplines in the same way that we have church disciplines. I don't know. It's it's just a little bit different because it's not the same. It's before Jesus and before the Magisterium. But I would certainly agree that the New Testament really shows and reveals, what ultimately the New Testament's it's pointing towards, and it makes some of those more or less meaningful in light of the truths revealed there. I think you were next. I think you would say.
So there's the synod this week, and I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about how what's spoken about there, it fits in those categories.
Yeah. What will happen in the synod is there will be an apostolic exhortation that will come out of it, and that is what will be authoritative. And so a lot of things we talked about, there's always, in terms of the Pope always strives to teach in unity with the bishops, and even the earliest councils, right, they're gathering the bishops together as, the Pope is kind of their, is the first among equals of sorts. The Pope is the first among them. But ultimately, the authoritative document that comes out of that will be issued by the Pope. There might be, sometimes there's a couple others, but that would be my guess as to what, as the most magisterially meaningful consequence of that. Now, in that document, there could be, it'll probably be more doctrinal. It might touch on church discipline, to some extent. I would be surprised if it had any dogmatic definitions, because those are not that common, especially for a synod. Like, you might see it, for like a council, but this is a synod, which is, it's a little lower. So, so within that document, the documents themselves have kind of a hierarchy, and within that, there'll be the parts of the teaching will kind of filter into these three categories. That's all.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So we have these distinctions, well, and you said there's some debate, but dogma, doctrine, discipline. I think whenever I talk to people about this, there's sort of like a temptation to kind of think that, so if it's a discipline or even sometimes a doctrine, there is no, because it's not a dogma, there's no real right answer. It's just sort of like what the church teaches, which that bugs me, because I can't believe that that's really the case, because otherwise we wouldn't have that. Why would it exist if it didn't matter? And so I guess I'm wondering, is it possible that disciplines, things that we recognize now as just disciplines, or having celibate, well, I guess that's kind of different, but whatever. Is it possible that disciplines or doctrines are sort of blatant dogmas, where they just haven't been recognized as dogmas, but they, they might, they are the right answer?
They tend to, anything that is basically a discipline or prudential judgment almost can't go up. Because if you think about it, so a discipline is we should not eat meat on Fridays, during Lent or whatever. And that's a very, there's not evidence that they did that in the early church. And clearly this is different, the church can choose the pastoral means, in context, and it can, it's a pastoral decision, right? And it's hey, we should do this because it's conducive to our holiness and our salvation. So it, that could never go up the scale, and similarly, the church's teaching about, the U.S. bishop's statement about nuclear weapons, well, it's too specific. Nuclear weapons are really specific technology. It's very hard to imagine a situation where they are consistent with the Catholic understanding of just war theory, but technology it comes in gradations, and it's just too specific to ascend, even if the early fathers had been against it or something, which is kind of ridiculous, but I would certainly agree and sympathize with the idea that we change discipline, and that's confusing, especially to non-Catholics. because it seems like things are can be iffy and can kind of change. And you can bring examples of church history where like this priest that's slavery is okay or whatever, and like that's always confusing to people. And the truth is that the church cannot speak infallibly on everything, and we can't pretend that we have more authority than we do, and ultimately we just have to try to tell people the truth and try to help them understand. We can change, certainly we can change disciplines, but we can't change our doctrine. And approach it with prayer, and that's kind of the best that we can do. And that's one of the reasons why I said at the beginning, when it's like you wouldn't just give this talk in like RCIA because it can be confusing. You need to give it to people that are that are in a little bit different place. So ultimately, I think that the answer to those questions isn't completely satisfying, but I think that's the right answer, or the right way to move on. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, go for it.
A little follow-up. So do you think that like dogma is exhaustive for absolute truth? Does absolute truth exist outside of church dogma? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Well, yeah, it's definitely like so mathematical propositions are church dogma, for example. So in fact, the church's magisterium only extends to matters of faith and morals. It doesn't extend to scientific truths or historical truths. The church doesn't have authority to talk about. So it's not as if there's this. The number of things you study in a day or do in a day, like very few of them are like dogma, right? So that's almost kind of there are some versions of extreme fundamentalism where it's not only like, so like kind of one view is that all revelation is in Scripture. Another view is all truth is in Scripture. So if you're a psychologist, why would you go to the library? You need to go read like the Old Testament, and that's how you try to do psychology. That's really challenging. So, anyway, and there's people who defend like geocentricism, which is like the view that the Earth is the center of the solar system, and kind of crazy stuff. Anyway, okay, I think that kind of helps. Yeah.
I think we tend to think of these, this hierarchy in terms of level of certainty, but there's also like the source of the revelation, so another criteria, like doctrine has to be directly revealed by God, whereas doctrine is more like the fruit of further reflection on that in light of like historical experience and natural revelation.
Yeah, so diversity in terms of like God's intervening capacity. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think too, what ends up as dogma is a lot of times a defensive posture based on the issues the church was dealing with in that particular time. So I would say there are probably dogmas that aren't as high in the hierarchy of truths as some doctrine, just because the church needed to think about a certain thing at a certain time. So. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks everybody. Let's all have a